Welcome to Experiments in Happiness with Michelle Lemus, the podcast for high-achieving women who've checked all the boxes but still feel something's missing.
I think one of the strangest things about being high achieving is that you can spend your entire day doing things and still go to bed feeling like you did nothing. And honestly, I think a lot of women live there constantly. They're productive, responsible, reliable. They're handling things all day long: emails and work and kids, conversations and appointments, decisions, problems, logistics. They're moving nonstop. And yet, somehow, at the end of the day, instead of feeling accomplished, they feel behind. And I think what's interesting is that most women assume this means they need to do more, be more productive, get more organized, work harder, push themselves more. But honestly, I don't think the problem is usually effort. I think the problem is that nothing ever feels like it counts. You finish one thing, and immediately your brain moves to the next thing. No pause, no recognition, no feeling of completion. Just, okay, what's next? And over time, that creates this really exhausting emotional experience where you're constantly doing without ever feeling done. I noticed this in myself a while ago. I realized I could have an incredibly productive day and still somehow feel like I wasn't doing enough. And honestly, that's such a strange feeling when you really stop and think about it. Because logically, you know you've been doing things all day, but emotionally, it doesn't register. And I think a lot of women experience this without understanding why. Because the issue usually isn't laziness, it's not lack of discipline, it's not lack of effort. The issue is that your brain has developed incredibly high standards for what it considers worthy of acknowledgement. And usually, those standards are tied to big accomplishments, major milestones, huge achievements, visible success, impressive outcomes. That's what your brain counts. Everything else gets dismissed. Sending the email doesn't count. Handling a hard conversation maturely doesn't count. Showing up when you are emotionally exhausted and doesn't count. Making progress slowly doesn't count. Taking care of yourself definitely doesn't count. And honestly, when nothing counts, nothing feels like enough. That's the trap. Because most of life is not made of giant milestones. Most of life is made of small efforts repeated consistently, tiny decisions, tiny actions, tiny moments of showing up. But if your brain only validates massive accomplishments, you end up emotionally overlooking almost your entire life. And honestly, I think that's part of why so many women feel chronically behind, because they're psychologically erasing their own effort constantly. I think this starts really early for a lot of women too, especially high achieving women. You get praised for outcomes, grades, achievements, performance, success. And over time, you subconsciously learn effort itself is not what matters, only impressive results matter. So now, as adults, many women have this internal system where they immediately normalize everything they accomplish. They downplay it automatically. Of course, I handled that. I should be able to do that. That's just basic adulting. That wasn't a big deal. And honestly, I think a lot of women have become so disconnected from recognizing themselves that they no longer even know how to feel proud of themselves anymore. That sounds sad. But I actually think it's incredibly common because they've trained themselves to move the goalpost constantly. Nothing ever lands emotionally. You achieve something and your brain immediately says, okay, but what's next? Or you should have done more. Or that's not enough yet. And eventually, you start living in this permanent emotional state of insufficiency. Like, no matter how much you do, you're still failing somehow. And honestly, that feeling is exhausting, especially because it creates this constant pressure to keep earning your worth, to keep proving yourself, to keep achieving enough to finally feel okay. But the finish line keeps moving. I think this shows up a lot in women who struggle to rest too, because rest feels undeserved when nothing feels complete. If your brain never acknowledges progress, then you never emotionally feel like you've earned rest. So even when you sit down, your nervous system still feels behind, still scanning, still thinking about what you should be doing. And honestly, I think many women are carrying invisible emotional pressure because they never let themselves fully register what they've already done. They only focus on what's unfinished. That's huge because what you focus on emotionally becomes your experience. If your brain constantly highlights, not enough, not done, more to do, then of course you'll feel overwhelmed, even inside objectively productive days. And I think this is especially hard for women who are naturally driven because driven women often normalize effort incredibly fast. Things that would completely overwhelm somebody else, they treat like baseline expectations. And again, that's usually because competence became part of their identity. People expect a lot from them, so they expect a lot from themselves. And eventually, they stop seeing their own effort clearly. I think one of the biggest mindset shifts for me was realizing just because something is expected of me doesn't mean it required no effort. That matters because women dismiss effort constantly if it falls into the category of, well, obviously I had to do that. But honestly, showing up matters, handling hard things matters, continuing forward when you're tired matters, making healthy decisions matters, having difficult conversations matters, regulating your emotions better than you used to matters. Small progress matters. And I think many women are starving for acknowledgement from themselves, not more achievement, acknowledgement, because there's a huge difference. You can keep achieving endlessly and still never emotionally feel accomplished if you refuse to recognize yourself along the way. And honestly, I think a lot of women are waiting for some giant future milestone to finally feel worthy of pride. When I lose the weight, when I make more money, when I finish the project, when life settles down, when I achieve enough, then I'll finally feel accomplished. But honestly, if you cannot acknowledge small wins now, you probably won't magically acknowledge big wins later either, because the pattern stays the same. Your brain just moves the goalpost again. That's why some incredibly successful people still feel deeply inadequate internally, not because they've accomplished nothing, but because they never emotionally let anything land. And I think this is one of the hidden costs of constantly operating in achievement mode. You stop experiencing your life. You stop feeling your progress. You stop letting yourself feel satisfaction. Everything becomes temporary. Everything becomes on to the next thing. And honestly, that's a painful way to live because there's no emotional reward system in it. No pause, no recognition. No, I did that. I handled that. I moved forward today. And I think many women dismiss this idea because acknowledging small wins feels silly at first, almost uncomfortable. Like, why would I celebrate sending an email? Why would I acknowledge doing basic responsibilities? Shouldn't I just naturally do these things? And honestly, I understand that reaction, but I think what people miss is that the goal is not fake hype. It's not pretending every tiny thing is extraordinary. The goal is simply accurate recognition, seeing reality clearly. And the reality is, most meaningful progress happens through ordinary repeated effort, not giant dramatic breakthroughs. Most of your life is built through tiny actions nobody claps for, tiny moments of discipline, tiny moments of courage, tiny moments of consistency. And if you psychologically erase all of those moments, you erase almost all evidence of your own growth. That affects motivation too, because motivation doesn't only come from future goals, it also comes from seeing evidence that your effort matters. And if your brain refuses to acknowledge effort, motivation starts drying up because emotionally, it feels like nothing you do makes a difference, even when it does. I think this is why so many women feel burned out and unfulfilled, even while accomplishing a lot, because they never stop long enough to actually experience themselves moving forward. They're too busy chasing the next thing. And honestly, I think one of the healthiest things women can start practicing is letting things count, not dramatically, not performatively, just honestly. I did that. That mattered. That required effort. That moved me forward. That's it. No giant celebration necessary. Just recognition. Because recognition creates completion. and completion matters emotionally. I think this is especially important for women who are hard on themselves because self-critical people often believe acknowledgement will make them lazy. Like, if I stop pushing myself, I'll stop growing. But honestly, most women are not at risk of becoming too gentle with themselves. They're at risk of becoming emotionally disconnected from themselves entirely. And there's a huge difference between accountability and constant self dismissal. You can still be ambitious without emotionally overlooking yourself every single day. You can still want growth without treating your current effort like it's worthless. And honestly, I think the ability to acknowledge yourself is a form of emotional health because it means you're no longer making your worth completely dependent on endless achievement. You're allowing yourself to matter during the process too, not just at the finish line. And maybe that's the experiment this week, not trying to do more, not trying to become more impressive, just practicing letting things count. At the end of the day, looking back and asking, what did I actually do today? What required effort? What mattered? What moved forward because I showed up? And then instead of immediately dismissing it, pausing for 1 second and actually letting yourself see it. Because honestly, you probably do far more than you give yourself credit for. The problem isn't that you're not accomplishing anything. The problem is that you've trained yourself not to emotionally register it.
Thanks for listening to Experiments in Happiness. You can find more tools and resources at experimentsinhappiness.com.